There is a sound a stone makes in the half-second before it gives way. Not a crack, not yet. A settling. A sigh almost the way old wood sighs before it splits. I heard that sound on the long terrace at Harrogate on the morning of the Founding Day procession, and I have heard it in my sleep every night since, though the stone in question has long since been replaced, and the little girl who stood beside it grew another inch taller by the time the leaves turned that same year. I am not a man who is easily believed when I say a sound saved a life. Guardsmen are trained to trust our eyes, our hands, the weight of a rifle, and the discipline of a drilled step. We are not trained to trust a sigh in old masonry. But I trusted it, and because I trusted it, I did something that no guardsman assigned to the immediate protection of a member of the royal family is permitted to do without a direct order, and for 3 weeks afterward I did not know whether I would keep my post, my rank, or my liberty. What I want to tell you is not really the story of that sound, or even of what I did when I heard it. It is the story of why I heard it at all, of what had already been taken from me, years before, by a warning I had not trusted the first time it came. My name is Corwin Hale. I served 11 years in the Palace Guard of Eldermoor before that morning, and I have served 8 more since, and for the last 6 of those years I have stood, more often than not, within arm's reach of Princess Maelin. I have never told this story publicly before now, and I want to say plainly why I am telling it at all. It was Maelin herself who asked me to, not long ago, on an evening when the two of us happened to be speaking of ordinary things, her studies, a horse she was training, ordinary palace gossip, and the subject of that founding day rose between us the way it sometimes still does, unbidden, the way old scars ache before a change in weather. She told me she thought other people, ordinary people who would never meet a guardsman or a princess in their lives, might find some use in hearing how a grief like mine had turned, over time, into something worth having lived through. I did not agree easily. I have spent most of my life keeping this particular door shut, and old habits, even ones I have since made peace with, do not open all at once simply because a friend asks kindly. But she reminded me of something I had once told her myself, in a private receiving room years before, about griefs that teach a man how to love the next thing fiercely enough to make the first loss mean something after all, and she asked whether I did not think other people, carrying their own quiet losses, might want to hear that a life could still be built that way. I did not have a good argument against her. I rarely have. She was 9 years old that founding day. She is older now, and I still watch her cross a room the way I watched her cross that terrace, with one part of my attention forever on the middle distance, looking for whatever the room has not yet decided to show me. That habit is the whole of what this story is about. It is a habit I paid for, and it is a habit I would not trade back for anything, not even for the thing it cost me to learn it. I had better start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the truth sits, and I have found that a truth told out of order only sounds like an excuse. I came to the Palace Guard the ordinary way, a boy from a farming county in the north of Eldermoor with steady hands and a talent for standing still, which is a rarer talent than people assume. I married young, a woman named Marisol who kept the books for a miller's cooperative and who laughed at my jokes long after they stopped being funny, which I took, correctly, as a sign that she loved me. We had one daughter. We named her Wren because Marisol said the name sounded like something small that could still sing louder than you'd expect, and Wren, it turned out, could indeed sing louder than you'd expect. She sang in the kitchen. She sang to the chickens. She sang, off-key and entirely without shame, in the market square until vendors twice her age were laughing along with her instead of trying to sell their bread. I will not describe for you the illness that took her. I have found in the years since that grief does not need details to be understood, and I have no wish to hand anyone the particulars of my worst week so that they might carry them around unasked. I will say only this. It began the way illnesses in small children so often begin, unremarkably, with a cough and a low fever that the physician in our village said was nothing to worry over. And I will say that I was on duty that week, 3 days' ride from home, standing a ceremonial post at a treaty signing that history has already forgotten, and that by the time I was granted leave to return, my daughter was gone. She was 5 years old. She had wanted, her mother told me later, only to see me once more before she stopped being frightened, and I was not there to be seen. The funeral was small, as these things are in farming counties, attended by neighbors who brought bread they did not know what else to bring, and by 3 of my fellow guardsmen who had ridden 2 days on their own leave to stand behind me at the graveside, saying nothing, simply standing, because that is sometimes the only gift men trained to silence know how to give each other. I remember almost none of what was said over her. I remember the weight of the small box, which I insisted on carrying myself the last stretch from the cart to the grave, though custom did not require it, and my captain at the time, a kind and weathered man named Sergeant Prout, offered twice to take the burden from me. I would not let him. I have thought since that it was the last duty I could perform for her, and I was not going to let anyone else perform it in my place, not after I had already failed the one that mattered most. I offered my resignation the following week in writing to Sergeant Prout, who read it standing in the doorway of my quarters, and then, instead of accepting it, folded it once and put it in his coat pocket without a word. He told me to take a season's leave instead, unpaid if the household required it, though it did not, and to write to him again when the season had turned if I still wished to leave the guard entirely. I spent that season at my father's farm in the north, working land I had not worked since I was a boy, because grief, I found, is more bearable when the body is tired enough by evening that the mind cannot stay awake to argue with it. I wrote to Prout again when the barley came in. I told him I had decided to stay. I did not tell him, because I did not yet have the words for it myself, that I had decided to stay because standing a post and watching over something precious was the only shape of purpose I still recognized in myself, and I was afraid of what I might become without it. Prout is retired now, keeping bees on a small holding 2 counties from where I grew up, and I visit him twice a year, in spring and at harvest, and we do not, even now, speak much of that folded letter. He knows I know what he did for me. I know he knows I am grateful for it. Some kindnesses are sturdier for never being spoken aloud, and his was one of them. I do not tell you this so that you will pity me. I tell you this because it is the reason I heard the stone sigh on the long terrace, and because a story that hides its true engine from you is not a story worth your time. After Wren died, Marisol and I stayed together for 2 years out of a kind of grim loyalty to the life we had built, and then we parted, gently, without blame, because we had each become a mirror the other could no longer bear to look into. She moved south to be near her sister. We still write twice a year at the solstices, and there is no anger left in either letter, only 2 people who loved the same small singing girl and could not in the end share the same house with her absence in it. I never remarried. I threw myself instead into the only thing that seemed to want me in return, which was the discipline of the guard, and I rose through it the way a man rises through anything he has stopped being afraid to sacrifice himself for. 6 years ago, Crown Prince Rowan's household was assigned a new tier of personal protection for his children, and I was one of 4 guardsmen selected for the posting nearest Princess Maelin. I did not ask for the assignment. I have wondered many times since whether some quiet clerk in the appointments office looked at my record, a guardsman with no family of his own left to distract him, unmarried, exemplary attendance, a reputation for watching a room longer than anyone else in it, and thought I was simply efficient. I have never told anyone, until now, that the true reason I watched a room longer than anyone else in it was that I had once looked away from a small warning and lost everything because of it, and I had promised myself, standing at Wren's graveside in a uniform I had almost resigned on the spot, that I would never again let a child's safety depend on my convenience. Princess Maelin, when I met her, was 3 years old and entirely unimpressed by me. She informed me, with the frank cruelty particular to very young children, that I stood like a fence post, and asked whether I ever blinked. I told her that I blinked constantly, simply too quickly for her to catch, and she spent the better part of an afternoon trying to catch me at it, which I count among the more pleasant duties of my career. A year later, at 4, she asked me, with the same directness, whether I had any children of my own. It is the question every guardsman near a royal nursery is asked eventually, by one child or another, and I had, by then, a practiced answer ready, a simple no, delivered lightly, meant to close the subject before it could open into anything I did not wish to discuss with a 4-year-old. She accepted it the way children accept most adult answers, without suspicion, and asked instead whether I would like some of her biscuit, which she was at that moment eating with the single-minded seriousness small children bring to biscuits, and I told her I would, and she broke off a piece smaller than a coin and pressed it into my glove with great ceremony, and I ate it standing at attention because protocol did not, strictly speaking, forbid it, and I did not have the heart to refuse her. I have thought of that small, dry piece of biscuit more often than its size would suggest I should. It was, I think now, the first kindness she ever offered me without knowing what she was offering it to. Over the years that followed, she grew from that unimpressed 3-year-old into a thoughtful, quick, occasionally mischievous girl who noticed things. The tired lines under a servant's eyes, a groundskeeper's limp, the particular quiet of her mother, Princess Maelin, on the anniversary of a hard week in the family's private history. She asked her tutors uncomfortable questions and remembered the answers longer than the tutors expected. She was, in short, the kind of child who makes the work of guarding her feel less like a duty and more like an honor, because you come to understand, standing near her day after day, that you are not simply protecting a title. You are protecting a person who is going to grow into someone worth having protected. When Maelin was 5, she went missing for the better part of an hour during a garden reception at Harrogate, not through any fault of her nursemaid, who had simply turned to answer a question from a visiting dignitary's wife, but through Maelin's own considerable talent for slipping unnoticed through a crowd of adults who were none of them looking down. I was not, that afternoon, assigned to her directly. I was covering a colleague's post along the garden's eastern hedge. But I had noticed, 20 minutes before anyone raised an alarm, that she had wandered toward the old fountain at the garden's far end, the one the household had long since stopped running because its stonework had begun to shed small chips into the basin, and rather than continue past it as my post required, I had drifted, without any order to do so, to a position where I could see the fountain clearly. When the alarm went up, a nursemaid's stifled cry, the beginning of the particular controlled panic that spreads through a household staff when a royal child cannot be found. I was already walking toward her, and found her exactly where I expected, sitting on the fountain's dry rim, entirely unbothered, arranging fallen chestnut leaves into what she informed me, with great seriousness, was a map of a kingdom she had invented that morning. I did not tell anyone I had already been watching the fountain. I simply reported that I had located her, which was true as far as it went, and returned her to her nursemaid, who wept with relief in a way that embarrassed her afterward. But Maelin remembered it. Children remember more than we credit them for. 2 years later, at 7, she asked me directly, apropos of nothing, in the middle of an entirely unrelated conversation about a horse she wished to be given for her birthday, "You already knew I was at the fountain, didn't you, before anyone called for me?" I told her I had simply happened to be nearby. She gave me a long, assessing look, the same look I would recognize years later, that she gave the collapsing balustrade's broken stone the morning it fell, and said, "I don't think you happened to be nearby. I think you watch for the things other people forget to watch for." I did not confirm or deny this. I have never been entirely sure how to answer a child who sees you more clearly than most adults manage to. There was a second occasion, when she was 8, at a countryside fete held on the grounds of a minor estate, whose owner had petitioned for years for the honor of a royal visit. The crowd that day was larger than the estate's modest grounds were built to hold, and partway through the afternoon, a temporary viewing rail erected along a low garden wall began to bow under the weight of spectators leaning against it to watch a display of falconry. I noticed the bow in the rail, a slight give in one of the support posts, nothing dramatic, nothing any of the other guardsmen on duty that day had cause to remark on, a full 2 minutes before it gave way entirely, spilling a dozen adults harmlessly into the flower bed below amid a great deal more embarrassment than injury. In those 2 minutes I had already, without drawing attention to myself, moved Maelin and Prince Torin a full 10 feet further along the garden path, ostensibly to get a better view of the falconer, and by the time the rail failed, both children were nowhere near it. Their mother, Princess Alara, thanked me for what she assumed had been simple good fortune in timing. I did not correct her. It did not yet occur to me at the time that a pattern was forming in the small decisions I kept making without quite naming them to myself, that some steady, watchful instinct in me had already begun treating every ordinary structure the royal children stood near as a thing that might, without warning, betray them, the way one ordinary week, years before, had betrayed me. My friend Owen Draper, who joined the Harrogate Guard 2 years after I did, and who would later stand my post through the worst 3 weeks of my career, used to tease me gently about it over meals in the guardhouse mess. "You watch railings the way other men watch pretty women," he told me once, not unkindly, and I laughed along with him, because it was easier than explaining that I watched railings and loose stones and thin ice on ornamental ponds, and the particular sag of an old rope swing in the palace orchard, because I had once trusted a physician's reassurance over my own unease, and had spent every day since paying for that trust. Owen did not know about Wren in those years. Almost no one at Harrogate did, beyond the bare fact that I had once had a daughter and lost her, and I did not correct his teasing, because it was gentler in those years to be thought merely careful than to be known as a grieving man, and I preferred then to be thought merely careful. Owen himself had come to the Guard by a rather different road than mine, the third son of a minor landholding family from the eastern counties, with 2 older brothers who would inherit everything worth inheriting and no particular inclination in Owen, himself, toward the law, the church, or the merchant trade that might otherwise have claimed him. He told me once, over a much later supper, that he had chosen the Guard mostly because the uniform fit him well, and the discipline gave a restless younger son something to be good at that his brothers were not, and that he had not expected, when he took the oath, to find in it anything more than a respectable way to occupy a life that might otherwise have drifted. He found more than that in time, the way most of us who stayed did, a purpose he had not gone looking for, a brotherhood of men who noticed when he was tired or troubled, and said nothing about it except to quietly cover his post an hour early. I valued his friendship more than I ever told him plainly in all those years, and it is one of the small regrets I still carry that it took a formal review of my own conduct to finally say so. Eldermoor itself in those years was a kingdom at a kind of settled, uneventful peace. No wars on its borders worth the name, no succession crisis, nothing to trouble the broadsheets beyond the ordinary churn of court gossip and guild politics. Harrogate sprawled across its low hill above the river the way it always had, its older wings built of the same gray stone as the long terrace, its newer wings added by kings who had wanted more comfort than their ancestors had thought to build in. I came to know every corridor of it the way a man comes to know a house he has lived in far longer than the one he was born to, and I came to know its rhythms as well. The early bell that woke the kitchens before the household stirred, the particular hush of the state rooms on a day with no visitors scheduled, the noise of the stable yard when the children were let out for their riding lessons. It was, in its unglamorous way, a good life, and I had built it out of very little, and I had built it, though I would not have said so aloud in those years, almost entirely around the small green-coated shape of a girl who was not my daughter and who I had, without ever intending to, begun loving as though the world owed me a second chance to get it right. I did not tell her about Wren. I did not tell anyone at the palace about Wren, not fully. A few of the older guardsmen knew I had lost a daughter, because such things travel in the quiet way that grief travels among men who work 12-hour watches together, but none of them knew her name, or her age, or the manner of her leaving, or the promise I had made over her grave. I kept it folded small and put away, the way you keep a letter you cannot bear to read again but cannot bear to burn either. I did my duty. I stood my post. I watched the middle distance the way I had trained myself to watch it, and if anyone had asked me why I was so particular about drafts near the nursery windows, or so quick to notice a loose paving stone before anyone else had stepped on it, I would have said only that it was good practice, and left it there. That was where matters stood on the morning of the Founding Day procession, 6 years into my posting, when I first noticed the crack in the balustrade. The Founding Day procession is the grandest public ceremony Eldermoor holds outside of a coronation, older, in fact, than most of the coronations, since it commemorates the founding of the kingdom itself rather than any single reign. Each year the royal family appears on the long terrace above the palace forecourt to greet the crowds that gather from every county to watch the procession of guilds, regiments, and civic banners pass beneath them. It is a day of trumpets and colored bunting, and children perched on their fathers' shoulders straining to see the king's own household wave down from the stone rail above. It is, by design, the most public and least private day in the palace calendar, which is precisely why it is also the day that gives every guardsman assigned to it the worst headache of his year. The ceremony traces back, so the household historians tell it, to the earliest days of Eldermoor itself, when the kingdom's first ruling house had nothing grander to offer its subjects than an appearance on a modest wooden platform above a muddy market square, a simple gesture meant to say only that the crown was near, and watching, and would not hide itself away behind walls the ordinary people could not see past. Every monarch since had kept some version of that gesture alive, through fires and rebuildings, and the slow accumulation of stone and ceremony that had turned a muddy platform into the carved long terrace I knew, and I had always found something quietly moving in the thought that the entire elaborate pageantry of the day, the guild banners, the trumpets, the crowds pressed 6 deep along the forecourt wall, traced back to nothing grander than a ruling family wanting its people to see, plainly, that it had not forgotten them. It seemed to me, standing my post there year after year, a fitting enough symbol for the work of guarding it, that even the oldest, grandest institutions in a kingdom are built, in the end, out of small acts of presence, repeated faithfully, long after anyone remembers exactly why they began. The long terrace itself is old, older than the current wing of the palace it fronts, a remnant of an earlier Harrogate that had been built around and preserved rather than replaced, out of the kind of sentiment that runs deep in old kingdoms. Its stone balustrade, waist-high and carved with the founding house's crests, had stood for close to 2 centuries. It was inspected every year before the procession, as a matter of routine, by the palace surveyor's office, and every year it passed that inspection without comment, because a balustrade that has held for 200 years earns, eventually, a kind of unearned trust from the people who walk past it. I had walked past it 1,000 times myself without a second thought. I noticed the crack 3 days before the procession only because I happened to be standing exactly where I should not have needed to be standing, checking sightlines for Maelin's position on the viewing platform, a habit no one had asked of me, and that I had never once explained, even to myself, as anything other than thoroughness. The crack ran along the underside of the coping stone nearest the platform's central section, hidden from a standing eye by the stone's own overhang, visible only if you crouched, as I had, to check that nothing loose lay beneath the platform boards. It was a hairline. It did not look, to any reasonable observer, like anything worth interrupting a national holiday over. I reported it anyway, the way I reported everything that gave me even the faintest unease, and the palace surveyor's deputy, a decent and overworked young man named Corliss, came out that same afternoon, tapped the stone twice with a small hammer, listened to the sound it made, and pronounced it a surface crack, cosmetic, the kind that appears in old mortar joints every few years and means nothing structural. He was not careless. He was thorough, by the standards anyone would reasonably hold him to. He simply did not hear what I heard, because he had not spent 6 years training himself to distrust every quiet thing that might, if ignored, turn out to matter. I want to be fair to Corliss, because what happened 3 days later was not his failure. It was the failure of 2 centuries of stone finally reaching the end of what stone can be asked to bear, in a spot no one, not the surveyor's office, not the masons who had last repointed that section a generation earlier, not I myself, if I am honest, could have known with certainty was about to give. I raised it a second time the day before the procession, and was told, gently but firmly, that the section had been reassessed and cleared, and that I should attend to my own duties and let the surveyor's office attend to theirs. I did not raise it a third time. I want you to understand that clearly because it matters to everything that follows. I did not defy anyone, I did not refuse an order, I did not make a scene. I accepted the assessment, the way a disciplined guardsman is trained to accept the assessment of the people whose expertise the assessment belongs to. But I did something else instead, something smaller and, as it turned out, larger than any protest I could have made. I adjusted, without telling anyone, the position I would stand in the next morning, so that I would be 2 steps closer to the central section of that balustrade than my assigned post technically required. That is where I was standing when the sound came. The morning of the procession broke clear and cool, the kind of early autumn light that makes even the gray stone of Harrogate look gilded. The forecourt below the long terrace filled by mid-morning with a crowd larger than any I had seen at a founding day in years. Word had spread, apparently, that the guild banners this season included a new design commemorating the 50th anniversary of the harbor trade agreements, and half the kingdom's merchant families seemed determined to see it in person. King Alaric and Queen Consort Morwenna took their places at the terrace's central point first, as protocol required, followed by Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara, and then, in the loose and cheerful disorder that the family had always permitted itself, once the formal receiving line was done, the children. Duke Edmund of Rosemont and Duchess Sylvie arrived shortly after, along with Prince Cale and Lady Imogen, filling out the terrace with the wider extension of the family that only appeared together on the handful of occasions each year that called for the full weight of the household's presence. I remember thinking, watching them settle into their places along the rail, how rarely I saw them all gathered in one spot outside of a funeral or a wedding, and how strange it was that a morning meant for celebration should have already begun sitting so uneasily in my chest, though I could not, at the time, have told you precisely why, beyond the crack Corliss's hammer had already dismissed twice. I had slept poorly the night before, which was not in itself unusual before a founding day. Every guardsman on the terrace roster slept poorly before a crowd of that size, but my particular unease had kept circling back to the coping stone rather than to the ordinary hazards of a large public gathering. Pickpockets, a fainting spell in the heat, a lost child in the crush below. I had walked the terrace alone at first light before the household stirred, and crouched once more beneath the central section to run my fingers along the hairline crack, which had not visibly changed in the 3 days since Corliss's inspection, and told myself, standing back up, that I had done everything a reasonable man in my position could do. I had reported it twice. I had been overruled twice, by people with more expertise in stonework than I possessed. The sensible course, the course any well-disciplined guardsman would follow, was to trust the palace surveyor's judgment and attend to my actual post. I told myself this with real conviction that morning, and I believed mostly that I had settled the matter in my own mind. I had not. I had simply moved my feet 2 steps closer without admitting to myself that I had not settled anything at all. Princess Maelin came out onto the platform in a green coat that her mother had chosen. She told me later, specifically because it matched the guild banner's new trim, and she spent the first quarter hour of the procession waving with both arms at a section of the crowd that had begun, delightedly, to wave back in matching rhythm, a small game of her own invention that had the effect of making several thousand strangers feel, for a moment, personally acknowledged by the crown. Prince Torin stood nearby practicing a more dignified, single-handed wave that he had clearly been coached in and clearly found tedious. Young Prince Bram had been permitted, as a special concession to his age, to remain indoors with his nurse, watching from a window, which spared everyone the trouble of managing a 6-year-old's attention span in front of half the kingdom. I stood where I had quietly repositioned myself, near enough to the central balustrade that I could, if I turned my head, see both Maelin and the exact stretch of stone coping that had made the sound of unease in my chest for 3 straight days. The guild procession began to pass below at the appointed hour, first the weavers in their dyed blue sashes, then the smiths with their polished ceremonial tools carried aloft rather than worn at the belt, then a long column of tanners and coopers and glassblowers, each guild trying, in its modest way, to outdo the one before it in color and noise, until at last the harbor trade guilds came into view, their columns stretching the full width of the forecourt, bearing a banner the size of a ship's mainsail that took a full 12 men to carry level. The crowd's noise rose with them, a swelling roar that seemed to travel up through the terrace stones themselves, and Maelin, delighted, leaned forward against the rail to see the great banner better, one gloved hand resting flat against the stone, coping exactly above the hairline crack that Corliss's hammer had pronounced harmless 3 days before, her whole small body angled outward the way children lean toward anything large and bright and moving, without a single thought for the ground beneath their feet. That was when I heard it, not a crack, a sigh, the particular low settling sound of old mortar finally admitting, after 200 years of quiet argument with gravity, that it had lost. I have relived the next 4 seconds more times than I can count, and I still cannot tell you, with total honesty, how much of what I did was thought and how much was simply the body doing what 6 years of drilled instinct, and 1 unhealed year of grief before that, had built it to do without asking permission first. I crossed the 2 steps that separated me from the princess. I did not call out a warning, because a warning takes time that stone in the act of failing does not give you. I put one arm across her chest and the other beneath her, and I pulled her backward and down, away from the rail, in the same motion a man uses to catch something falling rather than something standing still, and I turned my own body between her and the section of balustrade just as the coping stone, the whole 2-foot length of carved crest stone above the crack, sheared away from its bed and fell. It fell outward, away from the platform, down onto the empty margin of paving between the terrace wall and the forecourt crowd that the day's arrangements had, by long custom and no small mercy, kept clear for exactly this kind of unforeseeable failure. No one below was struck. I want to say that plainly and without qualification because it is the single most important fact in this entire account. No one was harmed, not the crowd, not Maelin. The stone struck the empty paving and broke into 3 pieces with a crack that silenced the guild procession for a full 10 seconds, and in the sudden quiet that followed, Princess Maelin, still gathered against my chest with my arm locked around her, said, in a small and startled voice, "Corwin, you're squeezing too hard," which was, all things considered, a remarkably calm thing for a 9-year-old girl to say roughly 1 second, after nearly going over a collapsing stone rail in front of several thousand of her father's subjects. I let go the instant she said it, which is to say the instant I had confirmed by the ordinary sound of her ordinary voice that she was entirely, completely unharmed. I knelt beside her on the platform boards, my hands still shaking in a way I would spend the following hour trying to hide, and I said something. I have never fully remembered what about the stone and the rail and being sorry for startling her, and she looked past my shoulder at the broken crest stone lying on the paving below and said, with the frankness I had come to expect from her since she was 3 years old, and told me I stood like a fence post. That would have hurt. Yes, I said, it would have. You knew it was going to fall. I suspected it, I said. I wasn't certain. She considered this with the peculiar seriousness children sometimes bring to questions adults have long since stopped asking themselves. Is that why you moved closer to me this morning? I noticed. You're usually 2 steps further back. I did not answer that question honestly, not then. I told her I had simply wanted a better view of the Harbor Guild's new banner, which was a small lie, the kind I have since decided a guardsman is occasionally permitted to tell a 9-year-old in the middle of a crisis, and she accepted it with the easy trust of a child who has never had a reason to doubt the people assigned to keep her safe. By then Prince Rowan and Princess Alara had reached us, Rowan's face gone the particular gray of a father who has just watched, from 20 feet away, the worst possibility of his life resolve itself in under 5 seconds, and Alara already kneeling to gather Maelin into her arms, running her hands over her daughter's shoulders and arms in the instinctive, wordless check that every parent performs before they can bring themselves to believe the child in front of them is truly whole. King Alaric had come as well, and Queen Consort Morwenna, and for a moment the entire receiving line stood clustered around the spot where the balustrade had failed, while below, the Harbor Guild's banner-bearers, uncertain whether to continue, held their column motionless in the sudden hush. She is unharmed, I said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, because it was the only sentence that mattered and I wanted it said before anyone had the chance to ask a question that assumed otherwise. Your Highness is entirely unharmed. It was Rowan who first grasped my forearm, hard enough that I felt it through the wool of my sleeve, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that it did not carry past the 2 of us, "You moved before it fell." "Yes, sir." "How?" I did not have an answer that would survive the scrutiny of a formal inquiry, and some part of me, the part that had already, in the space of those 4 seconds, begun calculating the cost of what I had just done, understood that this question, asked so gently and so urgently by a frightened father on a public terrace, would be asked again in a very different room, by very different people, in a tone considerably less forgiving. I told him the truth as far as I understood it in that moment. I heard the stone give. I didn't have time to call a warning. I acted. Rowan looked at me for a long moment, and then at his daughter, safe and slightly rumpled in her mother's arms, and then back at the broken stone on the paving below, and he said only, "Thank you," in a voice that cracked slightly on the second word and released my arm. King Alaric, for his part, said nothing at all in that first confused minute, though I have been told since, by men who stood closer to him than I did, that he had gone very still and very pale, in the particular way of a monarch who understands, in an instant, exactly how close his kingdom had come to a grief no ceremony could have repaired. Queen Consort Morwenna reached Maelin only moments after Alara did, and knelt without any apparent concern for her own formal robes on the platform boards, taking one of Maelin's hands in both of hers and asking, in a voice far gentler than the crowd below would ever have credited her with, whether anything hurt anywhere, even a little. Duke Edmund had already turned to the 2 junior guardsmen nearest the break in the rail, and was directing them, with the brisk competence of a man who had spent his own youth in a cavalry regiment, to cordon the section before anyone else drifted near the exposed edge. It was, in its own way, a testament to the household I served that, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, an entire family had reorganized itself around the single fact of a child's safety, without a wasted motion or a raised voice among them. Below in the forecourt, the crowd's confusion resolved slowly into something closer to awe than alarm. Once word passed back through the packed rows that the princess was unharmed, that a guardsman had caught her before the stone ever reached the rail. I did not hear, in that first hour, the swell of comment that would follow in the days after, the retellings and exaggerations that always attach themselves to a moment like that once it has left the mouths of the people who actually witnessed it. I heard only the ordinary noise of a procession finding its footing again, and Maelin, still catching her breath against her mother's shoulder, saying something to Alara that I did not catch, and Alara's answering laugh, startled and relieved in equal measure, the particular laugh of a parent who has just been given permission to stop being afraid. I would like to tell you that this was the end of the story, that a man who had, by any reasonable measure, just saved a princess's life was thanked, commended, and returned to his post with a clear conscience and an easy heart. It was not the end. It was, in fact, only the beginning of the hardest 3 weeks of my career, because saving a life and following protocol are not, in a royal household with 2 centuries of hard-won security procedure behind it, always the same act, and the palace, for reasons that had nothing to do with ingratitude and everything to do with a duty of care that extends far beyond any single guardsman's good instincts, was about to ask me to answer for the gap between the two. The procession resumed within the quarter hour, because a kingdom's oldest ceremony does not stop for a broken stone once the people at its center have been confirmed safe, and by all outward appearances the day continued much as it had begun. Trumpets, banners, the harbor guild's magnificent sail-sized standard drawing its swell of applause, Maelin waving again with both arms before the hour was out. Apparently unshaken in the resilient way that children so often are once the immediate fright has passed, and the adults around them have visibly stopped being afraid. I resumed my post as well, 2 steps back from where I had stood that morning, at the position my assignment actually specified, and I told myself, standing there in the autumn light with my heart still not fully settled in my chest, that I had done the only thing a man in my position could have done. I did not yet know that the palace's captain of the guard, a stern and entirely fair man named Edric Halloway, had already begun, before the procession had even finished, drafting the first line of an incident report that would determine, over the following 3 weeks, whether I would keep the post that had become the whole shape of my life since the day I buried my daughter. I want to pause here, before I tell you what came next, and say something plainly, because I have found that people who hear this story secondhand sometimes assume its shape before they've heard its ending. Nothing that happened to me in the weeks that followed was cruelty. Captain Halloway was not my enemy. The royal household was not ungrateful. What happened was something more complicated and, in its own way, more honorable than either gratitude or punishment alone. An institution built to protect children doing exactly what it was built to do, even when the man it was examining had, in this single instance, been right. That tension between being right and being permitted is the true center of everything I am about to describe, and I have come, in the years since, to respect it even more than I resent it, though I will not pretend the respect came easily, or that it came before the resentment did. The formal review opened 4 days after the procession, in a plain stone chamber in the palace's administrative wing that guardsmen of my rank rarely had cause to enter. Captain Halloway sat at its head, flanked by the controller of the household and a royal solicitor whose presence, I understood immediately, meant that this was no longer simply a matter of internal discipline. Word of the balustrade's collapse had already reached the broadsheets. A member of the crowd had captured the moment on a portable recording device, and the image of a guardsman hurling himself between a princess and a falling stone had, within 2 days, become the single most reproduced image in every paper in Eldermoor. I was, without ever having sought it, becoming a public figure, and public figures, I would learn, are held to a standard of scrutiny that private ones are spared. "Guardsman Hale," Captain Halloway said, in the flat, procedural voice he used for matters of record, You are aware of Statute 14 governing physical contact between assigned security personnel and members of the royal family under the age of majority. I am, sir. Recite it for the record. I recited it. I had known it since my first week of training, the way every guardsman assigned to a royal child knows it, because it exists for a reason that no one who has ever stood near a child of that rank could reasonably dispute. That unauthorized physical contact, however well intended, creates a vulnerability of its own, a precedent by which any man in a uniform might one day claim instinct as license to lay hands on a child he has no order to touch. Statute 14 exists because the alternative, a palace where any guardsman may seize a royal child whenever his own judgment tells him to, is a palace with no reliable boundary at all, and boundaries, Captain Halloway reminded me that day in a voice that was stern but not unkind, are not bureaucratic vanity. They are the entire architecture of what keeps children safe from the very people charged with protecting them. Should any of those people ever prove less trustworthy than I had, on that particular morning, turned out to be. You did not call a warning, the controller said. You did not signal the secondary guard stationed 8 feet from you. You made physical contact with Her Highness without any order, verbal or otherwise, from myself, from Captain Halloway, or from any member of Her Highness's own family present on the platform. That is correct. Why? I gave them the same answer I had given Prince Rowan on the terrace. I heard the stone give. I did not have time to call a warning. I acted. It was, as far as it went, entirely true and entirely insufficient because the question underneath the question, the one none of them asked directly that first day, though I could feel it sitting in the room like a held breath, was not what I had heard. It was why I had heard it at all, when the palace's own trained surveyor, standing in the same spot 3 days earlier with a hammer and a trained ear, had heard nothing worth stopping the procession over. I did not answer that deeper question, because I did not yet know how to answer it without opening a door I had kept shut for 4 years, and because some part of me, a proud part, I will admit now, a part that had built its whole sense of worth on never needing anyone's pity, believed that the truth, if I gave it to them, would sound less like an explanation and more like an excuse, the kind of thing a desperate man says when he has run out of better arguments. You will understand, Captain Halloway said, closing the folder in front of him with a quiet finality that I felt in my chest more than I heard in the room, that this office cannot simply commend an action it cannot also explain. A guardsman who acts correctly by fortunate coincidence is not the same as a guardsman who acts correctly by sound judgment, and this household has a duty to Her Highness, to her parents, and to every family whose children this guard has ever protected or ever will, to know which one you are before we return you to a post that places you, unsupervised, within arm's reach of a 9-year-old girl. You are suspended from active duty, pending the conclusion of this review. You will surrender your post to Guardsman Draper for the duration. I want to tell you that I took this news with the same discipline I had spent 11 years cultivating. I did not. I sat in that plain stone chamber for a long moment after Captain Halloway had finished speaking, and I felt something in me that I had not felt since the week I buried my daughter, a cold, falling sensation, as though the floor beneath a life I had carefully rebuilt had just given way as suddenly and as silently as the balustrade had. I want to be honest about something else, too, because I promised at the start of this account that I would not hide its true engine from you. What frightened me in that chamber was not, primarily, the loss of rank, or even the loss of income, though both mattered to a man who had built a modest and solitary life around a guardsman's steady wage. What frightened me was the thought of losing the post itself, of no longer standing 2 steps from Princess Maelin every morning, no longer watching the middle distance on her behalf, no longer being, in whatever small and unofficial way, the man whose whole daily purpose had become making certain that no other father in this kingdom would ever have to feel what I had felt, arriving 3 days too late, standing in a doorway that had already closed. I had built, without ever admitting it to myself in so many words, an entire second life out of the wreckage of the first, and in that chamber I understood, for the first time with real clarity, that the second life could be taken from me just as suddenly as the first one had been. Guardsman Owen Draper, who took my post for the duration of the review, was a decent young man and a friend, and it is to his credit and not mine that the 3 weeks which followed were bearable at all. He came to my quarters most evenings after his watch ended, sat with me over a plain supper, and told me, without ever quite saying so directly, what he could of how Princess Maelin was faring in my absence. She asked about you, he told me the second evening, wanted to know why you'd been reassigned. I told her you were resting after the excitement of the procession, which is not, strictly speaking, a lie. And she accepted that. For about a day, Owen said, with the particular dry humor of a man who has spent a great deal of time around observant children. Then she asked me directly whether you were in trouble for saving her. I did not have a good answer, Corwin, so I told her the truth in the smallest words I could find, that the guard has rules about who may touch a princess and when, and that those rules exist to protect her, and that you were being asked to explain why you'd broken one of them even though your reason for breaking it was a good one. What did she say to that? Owen was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. She said it didn't seem fair. And then she said something I've been turning over ever since. She said, he always watches me like he's already lost someone. I didn't know what to say to that, Corwin. I still don't. Is it true? I did not answer him that night. I have wondered since whether I should have, whether telling Owen, a friend in the privacy of my own quarters, might have made the eventual telling easier when it finally came. But grief, I have learned, does not obey the schedule you would set for it, and mine had been folded shut for 4 years by then, and a folded thing does not open simply because a friend asks it to, gently, over a cold supper. It opens when it is ready, or when it is finally, unavoidably required to, and mine was not yet either. The review continued through its second week, with a thoroughness that felt to me at the time almost punitive, though I understand now that thoroughness and punishment are not the same thing, and that a household charged with the safety of children owes those children nothing less than thoroughness, however uncomfortable it is for the man being examined. The palace surveyor's office reassessed the entire length of the long terrace balustrade, stone by stone, with instruments considerably more sensitive than Corliss's small hammer. Structural engineers were brought in from the university at Marrow's Cross. Statements were taken from every guardsman who had stood watch on the terrace that morning, from Corliss himself, from Prince Rowan and Princess Ilara, and with what I was told was the gentlest possible handling appropriate to her age, from Princess Maelin. It was midway through the second week that the surveyor's full report was finally delivered to Captain Halloway's office, and it was this report, more than anything I myself had said in that plain stone chamber, that changed the shape of the review, though not, as I had hoped, in the simple direction of vindication. The engineers from Marrow's Cross confirmed what I had suspected, and what Corliss's hammer had failed to detect. That a slow subsidence in the terrace's foundation, invisible from above and undetectable by surface inspection, had been placing uneven pressure on that particular section of coping stone for the better part of a decade, and that the hairline crack I had noticed was not cosmetic at all, but the first visible sign of a failure that had, by the engineer's own calculation, been between 3 and 6 months from occurring with, or without the additional stress of a large crowd gathered beneath it. Had the stone given way even a season earlier or later, on an ordinary day with no crowd assembled and no princess leaning against the rail, it might have fallen harmlessly into an empty terrace and been quietly repaired without a single soul the wiser. Instead, it had chosen that particular morning, with that particular child standing above it, to finally lose its 200-year argument with gravity. I remember the day that report was read into the record as the closest thing to vindication I felt during the entire ordeal, and I remember, just as clearly, how short-lived that feeling was. Because the report did not answer the question Captain Halloway had asked me on the first day of the review. It confirmed that the danger had been real. It did not explain how I had known, with enough certainty to act in 4 seconds without a verbal warning, when the palace's own trained surveyor, standing in the same spot with proper instruments, had not. The broadsheets by then had made up their minds regardless of what any formal review concluded. I was, in the popular telling, a hero, the guardsman who had trusted his instincts against official reassurance and saved a princess's life, and there was a swell of public sentiment in my favor strong enough that Captain Halloway himself remarked, dryly, that he had begun receiving letters from citizens who had never met me demanding my immediate reinstatement, and a commendation besides. I want to tell you that this public support felt like comfort. It felt instead like a second kind of pressure, a story being told about me in the papers that did not match the story I knew to be true, because the papers did not know, and I had not told them, that the real reason I had trusted a sigh in old stone over a trained surveyor's hammer had nothing to do with any special genius for masonry, and everything to do with a promise I had made at a small grave 4 years before that I would never again let a warning pass unheeded simply because a reasonable authority told me it was nothing to worry over. I was recognized twice in those weeks by strangers on the street during the brief hours I was permitted to leave the guardhouse grounds. Once by an elderly woman outside a bakery who gripped both my hands in hers and told me, with tears standing openly in her eyes, that she had a granddaughter Maelin's age, and that she had not stopped thinking about what I had done since she read of it. And once by a group of young apprentices who simply stood and applauded awkwardly on a street corner. Until I did not know where to look. I understand now that both moments were kindly meant, and I try, when I remember them, to hold on to the kindness rather than the discomfort. But at the time, suspended from the only post that had given my life its shape since Wren's death, uncertain whether I would be permitted to keep it, being thanked publicly for an act the palace itself had not yet decided whether to condemn or commend, left me feeling less like a hero than like a man being fitted, against his will, for a coat that did not yet belong to him. One letter reached me during those weeks that I have kept, still, folded in the same drawer where I keep the handful of things that matter most to me. It came from a father in a river town 2 days south of Harrogate, a stranger to me entirely, who wrote that he had read the newspaper account to his own daughter, a girl of about Maelin's age, and that she had asked him afterward whether he would do what I had done, if it were ever her standing near a falling stone. He wrote that he had told her yes, without hesitation, and that she had then asked him a second question he had not expected and had not, in the letter, pretended to have a ready answer for. How a father was supposed to know, in 4 seconds, which risk was worth his whole career and which was not. He said he was writing to me, a man he had never met, because he did not know who else might have an honest answer, and because it seemed to him that I, of all people, must have thought about the question longer than most. I did not write back to him for some weeks, until after the review had concluded, and when I finally did, I told him the only honest thing I had learned, that I did not think the question could be answered in the abstract, ahead of time, by any father sitting comfortably at his own table. I thought it could only be answered once, in the moment itself, by whatever a man had already become in all the ordinary days leading up to it. I do not know whether that answer satisfied him. It is, in any case, the truest one I have. There was a moment, near the middle of the 2nd week, when I let myself believe the whole ordeal might end quickly and kindly. A junior clerk in the controller's office, a young man I knew only slightly, mentioned in passing that he had heard the review was likely to be concluded within days, given the strength of public sentiment and the engineer's preliminary findings, which by then were already circulating informally among the household staff. I remember the particular lightness that rumor gave me for the better part of an afternoon, the first real lightness I had felt since the morning of the procession, and I remember, just as clearly, how quickly it was taken back from me. Captain Halloway summoned me the following morning, not to close the review, but to inform me, in his flat procedural voice, that the controller's office had decided the matter was too consequential, given its implications for Statute 14 and for the household's broader protocols, to be resolved on the strength of public sentiment or a favorable engineering report alone. The review would continue, he told me in full, and would not be hurried by newspapers or by well-meaning clerks who had spoken out of turn. I do not fault the clerk. I do not, in honesty, even fault Captain Halloway, who was doing precisely what his post required of him. But I remember sitting alone in my quarters that evening with the taste of that brief, false relief still sour in my mouth, and understanding, for the first time with real clarity, that I was going to have to find another way through this, that no rumor, no swell of public affection, no engineer's report was going to answer the question the panel actually needed answered, and that only I possessed the answer they were waiting for. Corliss himself was called to testify on the 9th day of the review, and I confess I felt for him keenly as he took his seat before the panel, twisting his cap in his hands in the manner of a young man convinced he was about to be blamed for a catastrophe he had, in fact, done nothing negligent to cause. Captain Halloway did not blame him, in the end, and neither, for what it is worth, did I said as much plainly, when my own turn came again, because it seemed to me a poor repayment for an honest man's thoroughness to let the review quietly imply he had been careless when he had not. Corliss described, in careful technical language, the standard inspection protocol he had followed, the visual survey, the tap test with the surveyor's hammer, listening for the particular hollow resonance that indicates a void beneath the stone's surface rather than a simple cosmetic fracture in old mortar. He had followed every step correctly. The subsidence that had, over the better part of a decade, been quietly undermining that section of foundation was not, the engineers from Marrow's Cross would later confirm, detectable by any method short of ground-penetrating instruments the palace surveyor's office did not, at that time, possess. Corliss had done his work faithfully. The stone had simply outpaced the tools available to examine it. "I want the record to reflect," Captain Halloway said, when Corliss's testimony concluded, "that this review finds no fault whatsoever in the surveyor's office's conduct. Deputy Corliss performed his duties to the full standard this household requires. What we are examining is not a failure of inspection. It is a question of what a guardsman is permitted to do when his own unverified unease outpaces what inspection has been able to confirm." I remember being grateful, hearing that at least one part of the record would be set straight regardless of what became of me. It was on that same day, though I did not learn of it until Owen told me that evening, that a junior guardsman named Petra Voss, who had stood the terrace's western flank during the procession, gave testimony that I have thought about many times since, because it raised, however gently, the one question I most dreaded being asked directly. Whether my repositioning that morning meant I had known, in some more definite sense, that the stone was going to fail, whether, in other words, I had been withholding information from my superiors rather than simply acting on an unverified hunch. Guardsman Voss testified, honestly and without any intent to harm me, that she had noticed over the preceding months that I habitually stood nearer to Princess Maelin than my post strictly specified, not only that morning but on a great many ordinary mornings besides, and that she had once asked me, in passing, whether I had been given some special instruction regarding the princess that the rest of the terrace detail had not received. I had told her truthfully that I had not. But the panel took her testimony seriously, as it was bound to, because a guardsman who possesses information his colleagues do not, and does not share it through proper channels, is a far more serious problem than a guardsman who simply feels, without evidence, that a stone might be about to fail. Captain Halloway questioned me closely on this point when my own testimony resumed, and I answered as honestly as I could, that I had no special instruction, no advanced knowledge, nothing beyond the accumulated weight of an unease I had not yet found the words or the courage to explain even to myself, let alone to the panel examining me. It was not, I understood even then, a fully satisfying answer. It would not become a fully satisfying answer until the day, more than a week later, that I finally gave them the whole of it. Maelin herself, I learned much later, made one attempt of her own to see me during the suspension, an attempt that very nearly succeeded through sheer force of a 9-year-old's determination. On the 12th day, having apparently exhausted her patience with adult evasions, she slipped away from her afternoon lessons, a minor scandal in its own right briefly, until the household understood the reason, and made her way down through the private wing to the guardhouse corridor, where junior staff quarters were kept, arriving at my door only to find it answered not by me but by Owen, who had been using my quarters that week to store the paperwork of his temporary posting. "Is Corwin in trouble because of me?" she asked him, apparently without any preamble at all, and Owen told me afterward that he had knelt down to her level in the corridor, the way I had so often done myself, and told her as honestly as he was permitted to that Corwin was not in trouble because of her, but because the rules that protected her did not yet have a clear enough answer for why he had broken one of them, and that the review's task was to find that answer. Not to punish a man for having saved her. "But he did save me," she said, with the flat, unanswerable logic of a child who has not yet learned to accept that being right and being permitted are sometimes two different things. Owen told me he had no good reply to that either, and that he had walked her back to her tutor himself, and that she had gone without further argument, though she had looked back at my closed door twice before the corridor turned a corner and took it out of sight. He told me this weeks later, once the review had ended, because he judged correctly that I would have found it unbearable to hear at the time, one more small proof, added to the pile I was already carrying, of what my silence was costing people who had done nothing to deserve the cost. I think of that corridor often. A 9-year-old girl, defying her own lesson schedule, walking the length of a palace wing to ask a grown man's friend whether her own safety had cost him his place in the world. I did not deserve, in that moment, the loyalty she was already offering me without being asked. I would spend the following days trying to become a man who did. It was near the end of the second week, on an evening when Owen had come by as usual, and found me sitting in the dark of my quarters without having lit the lamp, that I finally understood I could not carry the review through to its end without telling someone the truth, or without losing the post that had become, in the 4 years since Wren's death, the entire scaffolding of my remaining life. I want to describe that evening honestly, because it was the lowest point of the whole 3 weeks, and I have come to believe that a story which hides its lowest point from you cannot be trusted with its highest one either. I had by that evening half-drafted a letter of resignation. I had told myself it was the dignified choice, that a man who could not explain his own actions to the satisfaction of a fair and reasonable review had no honest claim to the post those actions had endangered, and that resigning quietly, before Captain Halloway was forced to dismiss me formally, was the last service I could render to a household that had given me, after Wren, the only reason I had found to keep rising each morning. I told myself this with great conviction. I believe, looking back, that it was mostly fear wearing the costume of dignity, fear that if I spoke Wren's name aloud in that plain stone chamber, in front of the controller and the royal solicitor in Captain Halloway's flat, procedural voice, I would not be able to finish the sentence, and that a man who cannot finish a sentence in front of his superiors has already, in some sense that mattered more to me than I could admit, lost. Owen found the letter on my table that evening, unfinished, and read enough of it before I could stop him to understand what it was. "Don't," he said. "I don't see another honest path through this, Owen." Then tell them the truth, he said. The whole of it, not the 4 seconds on the terrace. The 4 years before it. It isn't relevant to the review. It is the entire relevance of the review, Owen said, with more force than I had ever heard from him. They are asking you how you knew, Corwin. You have an answer. You have simply decided it is easier to lose your post than to say it out loud. I understand why. I would not wish that grief on any man's tongue. But I have watched you stand 2 steps closer to that child than your post required for 6 years, and I never once asked you why, because it was not my place, and because I assumed, the way most of us assumed, that it was simply the kind of man you are. I did not know it was the kind of man Wren's death made you. I think, if you told them that, they would understand you a great deal better than they understand you now. I did not answer him that night either, but I did not finish the letter of resignation, and I have wondered since whether that single unfinished sentence, the letter sitting on my table, incomplete, neither sent nor discarded, was the true turning point of the whole affair, more than anything that happened in the review chamber itself. I had stopped moving toward the door. I had not yet found the courage to move toward the truth. I simply stood, for 2 more days, in the narrow space between them, the way I imagine a great many people stand in the hardest weeks of their lives, unable to go backward, and not yet ready to go forward. It was Princess Maelin herself, in the end, who moved me the rest of the way, though she never knew, until much later, what she had done. I was not permitted to see her during the suspension, a reasonable precaution, given the nature of the review, though it was its own quiet grief on top of the larger one, not to stand my post each morning and see her small, familiar shape crossing the nursery courtyard. But on the 16th day of my suspension, I was summoned, unexpectedly, not to the plain stone chamber where the formal review sat, but to a private receiving room in the family's own wing, where I found not Captain Halloway or the controller, but Crown Prince Rowan, alone, standing at a window with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture I recognized, because I had stood in a version of it myself, many times, in the years since Wren. "Sit, Corwin," he said, which surprised me, because in 6 years of service he had never once used my given name in a formal setting. "This is not the review. I want to be clear about that before we begin. This is a father asking a question he has no official standing to ask, and you are entirely within your rights to decline to answer it." I said. "Maelin has asked me 3 times this week why you have not come back," he said. "I have given her 3 different versions of the same evasive answer, and she has, on each occasion, seen through it more quickly than the last, because she is, as you well know, an unusually perceptive child. Yesterday she said something to me that I have not been able to set down since, and I find I cannot in good conscience continue this review without at least giving you the chance to hear it and respond to it, whatever your answer costs you." "What did she say, sir?" Rowan turned from the window. "She said, 'Papa, I think Corwin already knew what it would feel like to lose someone before he ever met me. I think that's why he watches me the way he does. I think it would be a very lonely thing to explain, and I think that's why he hasn't." Rowan paused. "She is 9 years old, Corwin." I do not know where a 9-year-old girl learns to see that clearly into a grown man's silence, except that she has apparently been standing near you long enough to learn it from you directly, whether either of you intended the lesson or not. I sat in that private receiving room for a long moment, and I felt the same folded thing in my chest that had stayed shut through Owen's gentle prodding, and my own half-written letter of resignation begin, finally, to give, not violently, not all at once, but the way the coping stone on the long terrace had finally given, after years of quiet, invisible pressure that no hammer had been able to detect from the outside. "Her mother," I said, and heard my own voice come out rougher than I intended, "named her Wren. Because she said the name sounded like something small that could still sing louder than you'd expect. And she could, sir. She sang everywhere. In the kitchen. To the chickens. In the market square, off-key and without a shred of shame, until grown men twice her age were laughing along instead of minding their stalls. I told him the rest of it then, not with the same total starkness I have given you here, but close to it, sitting in that quiet room while the afternoon light moved slowly across the carpet between us. I told him about the treaty signing 3 days' ride from home, and the physician who said it was nothing to worry over, and the leave that came too late, and the promise I made at a small grave in a uniform I had nearly taken off for good that same week. I told him that I had spent 4 years since then training myself never again to let a small warning pass simply because a reasonable authority had pronounced it nothing to worry over, and that when I heard the stone sigh on the long terrace, I had not, in any deliberate sense, decided to break Statute 14. I had simply, in 4 seconds, become the man that grief had spent 4 years quietly building, whether I had ever meant to build him or not. Rowan did not say anything for a long while after I finished. When he finally spoke, his voice had the same crack in it I had heard on the terrace itself, the day the stone fell. "I did not know," he said. "In 6 years I did not know. I am ashamed of that, Corwin, though I understand it was your choice to keep it, and I do not fault you the choice. I did not want it known, sir. I did not want to be watched with pity instead of trust." "I understand that better than you might think," Rowan said quietly, and did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to, because a man does not need to explain every private grief of his own household to a guardsman in a single afternoon, and I had already, by then, been given more of his time and his honesty than I had any right to expect. "I will tell you what I can offer and what I cannot. I cannot end the review, Corwin. It is not mine to end, and it should not be the household's duty of care to my daughter, and to every child this guard will ever protect, does not bend simply because the man in question turns out to have a private, honorable reason for the thing he did. Statute 14 exists for children whose guardians do not have honorable reasons, and the review has to be able to tell the difference between the two every time, without simply taking a good man's word for it. But I can tell Captain Halloway what you have told me, if you will permit it, and I can ask that the review's final hearing be conducted with the full context available to it, rather than the 4 seconds on the terrace alone." "I would be grateful, sir," I said. "I find I no longer have the strength to keep it folded away regardless of the review's outcome. I would rather it be known and cost me the post than remain hidden and cost me nothing." Rowan studied me for a moment with an expression I have thought about many times since, not pity, which I had feared, but something closer to recognition, the look of one man who has carried a private weight seeing, for the first time, the shape of another man's weight laid down beside it. "Then let us see what the review makes of it," he said, "with the whole truth in front of them instead of half of it. I do not think, Corwin, that you give this household enough credit for its own capacity to understand grief. We are not so far removed from it ourselves as you may imagine. I used the 4 days before the hearing as I had used almost no time in the 4 years since Wren's death, in stillness rather than in motion. I rode out on the second of those days to the small county churchyard where she is buried, a half-day's journey from Harrogate, and sat with her a while, the way I did perhaps twice a year, though I had never once in all those visits said aloud the words I finally said to her that afternoon, that I was about to tell strangers her name, and her age, and the shape of the year I lost her, in a stone chamber built for matters of discipline rather than matters of the heart, and that I hoped, wherever the dead keep their hopes, that she would not mind being spoken of so plainly, to people who had never had the chance to hear her sing. I do not believe, in any doctrine I could point to, that the dead hear us. I believe, instead, that grief sometimes requires an audience even when no audience remains to receive it, and that speaking to a small headstone in a quiet churchyard is less about being heard than about finally, after 4 years, allowing myself to be the kind of man who says such things aloud at all, rather than folding them away where no one, living or dead, could reach them. I rode back to Harrogate that evening with something in my chest that was not quite peace. I do not think a loss like mine resolves into peace, not fully, not ever, but was, at least, no longer entirely dread. I had decided, somewhere on that ride, that whatever the panel concluded, I would not regret having finally said her name where it could be heard. The final hearing of the review was convened 4 days later, in the same plain stone chamber, before the same panel, Captain Halloway, the controller, the royal solicitor, with one addition. Crown Prince Rowan himself sat at the table's far end, not as a witness called to testify to the facts of the incident, but, as he put it when the solicitor questioned the propriety of his presence, as a father who believes this review has not yet heard the full account of the man it is examining, and who asks the panel's indulgence to hear it now. I will not pretend to you that telling the whole truth in that chamber was easy. It was, in fact, the hardest thing I had done since the week of Wren's funeral, harder in its own way than the 4 seconds on the terrace itself, because those 4 seconds had required only action, and this required words, spoken slowly, in front of strangers with the authority to end my career, about the worst week of my life. I told them about Wren. I told them her age, and the illness I still will not describe in detail even now, and the treaty signing 3 days' ride away, and the leave that came too late for me to say goodbye the way she had wanted, and the promise at her grave. I told them that I had never once, in 6 years of guarding Princess Maelin, considered my vigilance toward her a burden or a duty performed out of mere professionalism, that it had become, without my ever choosing the word for it, an act of devotion, the shape grief had finally found to make itself useful instead of merely unbearable. I told them that when the stone sighed on the long terrace, I had heard, in that instant, not a structural warning that a more objective man might have weighed and measured and perhaps still, correctly, dismissed as insufficient grounds for breaking Statute 14, but the exact, unbearable sound of a warning I had once failed to heed in time, and that I had moved before I had finished deciding to move, because some part of me had already decided, 4 years earlier, standing over a small grave, that I would never again choose caution over a child's safety when the two seemed, even for a moment, to be in conflict. When I had finished, the royal solicitor, a precise and not unkind woman named Mistress Pharaoh, asked the question I had known someone would eventually have to ask. Guardsman Hale, do you believe that a private grief, however genuine, entitles a man to override this household's protocols whenever his own judgment tells him to? I told her no. I told her that I did not believe grief entitled a man to anything at all, that it had cost me a daughter and very nearly cost me my post and my dignity besides, and that if the panel concluded my instinct that morning had been luck dressed up as conviction, I would accept that conclusion and whatever followed from it, because the alternative, a household that simply trusted every guardsman's private conviction over its own trained protocols, was not a household I would wish to serve in, let alone one I would wish Princess Maelin to grow up inside of. I said that the only thing I could offer the panel, beyond my account of the 4 seconds themselves, was the truth of where that account came from, so that they might judge it as clearly as I was finally able to give it to them. Captain Halloway asked one further question before yielding the floor, a question I had not anticipated and have thought about often since, because it cut more precisely to the heart of the matter than any other question the review put to me. If it had been a servant's child standing at that rail, Guardsman Hale, a stranger's child, someone with no rank or title at all, would you have moved just as quickly? I did not have to think long before answering, and I have come to believe the speed of that answer told the panel more than the words themselves. I told him yes. I told him that the promise I had made at Wren's graveside had never once in 4 years distinguished between a child who wore a crown and a child who did not, that grief, in my experience, does not care about rank, and that if anything, my years of guarding Maelin specifically had only sharpened an instinct I would have carried, unchanged, to any child standing near any failing thing, in any corner of this kingdom, whether the household ever knew my name or not. Captain Halloway nodded slowly at that, and made a note in the margin of his file that I was never permitted to read, though I have wondered ever since what it said. Princess Alara had submitted a brief written statement of her own, which the controller read into the record near the close of the hearing, at her own request rather than Rowan's. It said, in its entirety, that in 6 years of watching me guard her daughter, she had never once seen me act with anything other than the fullest discipline the post required, that she trusted my judgment as completely as she trusted any guardsman in the household's employ, and that whatever the panel decided regarding Statute 14 as a matter of policy, she wished it recorded that as a mother, she considered herself, and her daughter, fortunate beyond measure that I had been standing where I stood that morning. I did not know, until that statement was read aloud, that she had prepared it. I have never fully thanked her for it, because I have never quite found the words that would not sound, in the saying, smaller than what it meant to me. Captain Halloway listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, his hands folded on the closed file in front of him, and when I had finished, the chamber sat in a silence longer than any that had passed between us in 3 weeks of formal questioning. "Guardsman Hale," he said finally, and his voice, for the first time since the review had opened, had lost its flat procedural edge. "I want to be plain with you about what this panel can and cannot conclude from what you have told us today. We cannot conclude that instinct born of personal grief is, as a general principle, a sufficient substitute for verified protocol, because if we concluded that, we would be telling every guardsman in this household that his own private history, however honorable, entitles him to override the safeguards this household has built, at considerable cost, to protect its children from the far more common case, the guardsmen whose instincts are not honorable at all. That principle must hold, Corwin, regardless of what we decide about you today, because it is the principle, and not any single man's good character, that keeps every child in this palace safe." I nodded because I understood him, and because I had come by then to believe he was right. "But we can conclude," he went on, "having now heard the structural engineer's report confirming the danger was genuine, and having now heard the full account of the judgment that led you to act on a warning our own trained surveyor did not act on, we can conclude that this was not recklessness dressed up as instinct. It was, instead, the rarest kind of judgment this guard can hope to cultivate in any of its men, judgment sharpened, rather than clouded, by a grief most men would let clouded entirely. That is not something this panel can write into a general rule, Corwin. It is not repeatable. It is not trainable in the ordinary sense. I cannot instruct every guardsman under my command to first suffer what you suffered, in the hope that it might one day save a child's life. But it is, on the specific facts before us, the truth of what happened on that terrace, and I do not believe this household is served by punishing a man for the honest shape of his own devotion, however unusual its origin. The panel's finding, delivered in writing 2 days later, restored me to active duty without formal censure, though it noted, for the permanent record, that the incident had prompted a review of Statute 14 itself. A narrow amendment, adopted the following season, permitting a guardsman to act on his own judgment, without a verbal order, in circumstances of genuine and imminent physical danger that leave no time for one, provided such action be reported and reviewed. Exactly as mine had been in full. Captain Halloway told me, some months later, that the amendment had come to be known informally among the guard as the Hale exception, a name I have never grown fully comfortable with, because it suggests a rule built around one man's grief rather than around the plain, defensible principle that a child's safety should never wait on a formality when 4 seconds is all the warning anyone is given. King Alaric himself sent for me privately, once, in the days between the panel's finding and my return to duty. A summons that unsettled me more than the entire review had, if I am honest, because I had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with the king directly in 11 years of service, and I could not imagine what he wished to say to me that could not have been said through Captain Halloway or Prince Rowan. He received me in a small study rather than any formal chamber, and he did not stand on ceremony, which surprised me further. He told me that he had read the full transcript of the final hearing himself, in its entirety, and that he wished me to know two things directly, from his own mouth rather than through an intermediary. The first was that Statute 14 would stand, amended, exactly as the panel had recommended, and that he considered the amendment sound. The second was that he did not believe a kingdom was well served by men who mistook grief for weakness, and that he had known, in his own life, enough of both to tell the difference. He did not say more than that, and I did not ask him to, because I understood by then that Harrogate held more private griefs within its walls than its public face ever let on, and that a king's dignity, like a guardsman's, is often built on exactly the things he chooses not to say aloud. He shook my hand before I left, which I am told is not a small thing for a monarch to do, and told me to return to my post with a clear conscience, because I had, in his judgment, more than earned it. I wrote to Marisol that same week, the first letter I had sent her outside our usual solstice exchange in all the years since we had parted. I told her what had happened on the long terrace, and what had happened in the stone chamber afterward, and that I had finally said Wren's name aloud to people who had never known her, in the hope that it might save another man's daughter someday, or at least another family's peace of mind. Marisol wrote back within the fortnight, a longer letter than either of us had sent the other in years, in which she told me she was glad that I had spoken, glad that some good had finally been let out of a grief we had both spent so long trying to carry quietly and alone, and glad, she wrote, that I had found a way to keep loving a child fiercely even after the world had taught me how much loving a child could cost. She wrote that she still could not have stayed in that house, could not have gone on waking each morning inside the shape of what we had lost, but that she was glad, all these years later, that I had found a shape of my own to live inside instead. I keep that letter with the one from the Rivertown father in the same drawer, and I read them both, sometimes on the solstice, when I write to her again. I returned to my post on the long terrace, and to Princess Maelin's household, on a gray morning 11 days after the final hearing, and I want to tell you honestly that I do not remember a single word of the formal welcome Captain Halloway offered me that morning, because the whole of my attention was fixed on the nursery courtyard, where a 9-year-old girl in a blue coat had spotted me from 30 feet away and was already running. Without any of the dignity her tutors had spent years attempting to instill in her, directly toward me. She stopped just short of an embrace, because even at 9 she had absorbed enough of palace protocol to hesitate, and instead she simply stood in front of me, looking up, and said, "Papa told me. About Wren." "Yes," I said, "I understand he did." "I'm sorry," she said, with the plain, unguarded seriousness that had always been the truest thing about her. "I'm sorry that happened to you. It isn't fair that you had to be sad in order to save me." I knelt down to her level, which was not, strictly speaking, required by any protocol, and which I did anyway, because by then I had stopped needing every gesture between us to be sanctioned by a statute. "Your Highness," I said, "I would not undo a single day of missing her, not even to have spared myself the sadness, because missing her taught me how to watch for you the way I do. I would not trade that lesson back, even for an easier heart. Some griefs, if you let them, teach you how to love the next thing fiercely enough to make the first loss mean something after all. I think that is the only kind of sense a loss like that ever really makes." She considered this for a long moment, in the way she considered most things that mattered to her, and then she said, "Then I think Wren would be glad that you found someone else to sing loudly for, even if it's not the same kind of singing." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since, because a 9-year-old girl, without ever having met my daughter, without knowing a single fact about her beyond her name and the manner of her leaving, had found, in a single unrehearsed sentence, the truest description of what my 6 years of watching her had actually been. It was not a substitution. Wren cannot be substituted, and I have never wished her to be. It was, instead, exactly what Maelin had named it. A different kind of singing, built out of the same love that had first learned its voice in a kitchen and a market square 4 years before Maelin was ever born, offered now, and every ordinary morning since, to a girl who had done nothing to earn it except exist, and be young, and be, in her own way, worth every quiet vigilance I had left to give. 2 years ago, at a ceremony marking the anniversary of the Founding Day Amendment, a modest occasion, attended mostly by household staff, and a handful of officers from the Surveyors' Guild, a young officer new to the terrace detail asked Maelin, by then old enough to be asked such questions directly, whether she had ever resented the fuss the incident had caused, or the strange formality of having a statute quietly known, among the guard, by a guardsman's name. She did not hesitate before answering him, and Owen, who told me of the exchange afterward because I had not been present for it myself, said her answer had struck him as far too composed for someone her age, though I have come to think it was simply the truth, spoken plainly, the way she had always spoken it. She told the young officer that she did not think of the statute as a piece of fuss at all. She told him that she thought of it as the one useful thing to come out of the worst afternoon of a good man's life. A rule that meant some other guardsman, in some other household, might someday act in 4 seconds to save a child he had never met, without first needing to lose someone of his own to learn how. She said she hoped, if that day ever came, that whoever benefited from it would never have to know the cost that had first written the rule into being. I do not think I could improve on that answer if I tried for another 8 years to find better words myself. I still stand 2 steps closer to her than my post technically requires, though the amended statute has long since made that habit an entirely lawful one. I have watched her grow, in the years since the long terrace, into a young woman who asks harder questions of her tutors and remembers the answers longer than ever, who still notices the tired lines under a servant's eyes before anyone else in the room does, and who once, on the anniversary of the day the balustrade fell, found me on my own without being asked, and simply sat beside me for the better part of an hour, saying nothing at all because she had worked out, on her own and without my ever teaching her to, that some anniversaries are better honored in silence than in words. Captain Halloway retired 3 years after the review, and at his farewell dinner he told a story I had not expected him to tell in front of the assembled household. The story of the folder he had closed that first day of my suspension, and how he had gone home that same night, he admitted, uncertain whether he had just done his duty correctly or simply done the easiest thing available to a tired man at the end of a long inquiry. He said that watching me stand my post in the years since, watching the amended statute hold steady through 2 further incidents in other households, where a guardsman's swift, reported judgment had done exactly what it was designed to do, had settled that uncertainty for him more completely than any argument I could have made in the chamber itself. I did not know, until that dinner, that he had carried his own doubt about the outcome for 3 years. It humbled me to learn it. I had spent so much of the review believing myself the only man in that chamber whose certainty was in question. Owen Draper is a captain himself now, having earned the rank through years of the same steady, unglamorous competence that had made him such good company through the worst weeks of my life, and he still teases me, occasionally, about railings, though the teasing has softened over the years into something closer to a private joke between old friends than a young man's gentle mockery. He was the one who first began calling the amended statute, the Hale exception, in the guardhouse mess, a habit I have never quite managed to break him of, though I have asked him to more than once on the grounds that it puts too much weight on one man's grief and not enough on the plain principle underneath it. He tells me every time that the principle is easier for young guardsmen to remember when it has a name attached to a face they know. And I have, over the years, come around to conceding that he may be right. I still ride out to the county churchyard twice a year, in spring and near the solstice, and I no longer feel the need to explain to Wren, the way I once did in the 4 days before the final hearing, what I am about to do or say to anyone else. She would be a young woman now, older than I sometimes let myself imagine, and I have found, in the years since I finally spoke her name aloud in that plain stone chamber, that I can hold the thought of who she might have become alongside the plain fact of who Princess Maelin is becoming, without one thought crowding out the other, the way I once feared it might. Grief, I have learned, does not have to compete with love for the same room in a man's chest. Given enough time and enough honesty, it can learn to make space instead. The stone that broke that morning was replaced within the month, recut from the same quarry, carved by the same guild of masons who had first set the balustrade 200 years before, and if you walk the long terrace today, you would not be able to tell by looking which section is new and which is old. I can tell. I know exactly where it stands, and I still, most mornings, let my eyes rest there for a moment before I take up my post, not out of any lingering fear, but out of something closer to gratitude, for the sigh in old stone that gave me 4 seconds warning, for the daughter who taught me, at far too great a cost, never again to let a warning pass unheeded, and for the small, sharp-eyed girl who has never once in all the years since let me forget that grief, given enough time and enough purpose, can be taught to sing.